And it sort of fits with our discussion of near-death experiences. We've talked about it many times on the program, the nature of these experiences, how it follows a familiar pattern, going into the light, meeting loved ones. It's generally a transformative experience, a positive experience. At least we've heard that over and over. Nancy Evans Bush has written a new book called Dancing Past the Dark, in which she says there are a heck of a lot of these experiences that are, as she expresses it, distressing near-death experiences, and it's a fascinating book. We pick up the conversation with our guest, Nancy Evans Bush, right after this on Coast to Coast AM. In the preface to the book we're going to discuss for the next 2 hours, Dr. Bruce Grayson, who's of the University of Virginia School of Medicine, expresses it this way. He says, although this book was written by a person who's had a distressing near-death experience, it is not by any means a book just for them. This is a book for anyone who aspires to face the totality of the world in which we live. All of us have experiences for which we're unprepared. All of us at one point or another face frightening or distressing experiences, and all of us, sooner or later, need to master the art of dancing past the dark. And that's the title, Dancing Past the Dark, Distressing Near-Death Experiences by Nancy Evans Bush. Nancy, it's great to have you on the program.
Thanks so much.
Let's start it this way. Long before you were studying this on an academic level, you had the experience. Tell us the story.
The experience itself happened when I was 28. I was in labor with my second baby, and actually I was in active delivery. And in the custom of the time, I was anesthetized. And the next thing I knew, I was flying over what I took to, I was flying over a roof. And then I realized it must be the hospital roof because I could see buildings around it, and one of them was the school in which I was teaching. And then as I kept flying, it wasn't exactly flying. It was just like shooting into space. And I could slowly see the dim, it was midnight, but I could see the dark shapes of the landscape, and eventually I could see the curvature of the earth. Now, this was way back in the very early 60s, before we were so accustomed to seeing pictures of the earth from space. And it was very exciting because I remember thinking, oh, it's true, it really is round, because I could see the earth. And I just kept going into space, and at some point, moving towards me, there were some circles. They were simply round black and white circles, and they were clicking black to white, white to black. And they had a message. Now, this was not a verbal message in words, but it was just thought to thought, telepathic. And the message was, you don't exist, and you never did exist. It's all been a joke. Your life was a joke. Earth was a joke. You were allowed to believe it was real, but it never was real. And this is what there is, just this big empty space. And I was arguing with them passionately, trying to come up with all the proofs I could think of that would confirm my existence. I had memories. I could recite facts about geology and my mother's childhood And how could I know these things if they weren't real? I had a baby at home, a toddler. She was real, and it was simply, no, none of this was real. It was a joke. I was permitted to believe it, but it never existed. And then the circles moved away, and I was out there, wherever out there, however out there might be defined. And what struck me particularly was, why didn't God show up? Because if I was out there, wasn't God supposed to be out there? And it was just me.
Did you think at the time you were dead?
I'm sorry. We have a not very good connection from my end here.
Okay, I'll ask it slower. Did you think at the time that you were dead? Did it occur to you that you had died?
No. It never occurred to me that I was dead, because I was thinking, and my assumption was that if you're thinking, you're not dead. It never occurred to me when I woke up that I had been dead for the same reason. I did think, when I die, that's what it will be like. But it never occurred to me that I had been dead.
In your experience, did you have any of the other kinds of things that are described by in the typical NDE, where you see a loved one or you go into...
Elements of the experience actually parallel quite closely the essential elements of any near-death experience. There's the typical out-of-body experience. There is movement through a dark space. There is encounter with entities. There are messages. And back in the early days of near-death research, Kenneth Ring at the University of Connecticut devised what he called a weighted core index scale, experiencer index scale. And on his scale, if you achieved a score of, I believe it was 7, you had a genuine near-death experience. If you, with a score of 11, it was a core experience. And I tested my own experience against his index and came up with a score of 17. So clearly, although the emotional elements of the experience are not those of the radiant, blissful experience, the core constituents are the same type of element. And this is pretty common across distressing experiences.
Distressing is one way to put it. Depressing is another way. I would think that whoever these entities were that were telling you it's all a joke, it was kind of cruel. And I'm wondering, when you came back, did you share the experience with your family? Did you tell loved ones about it?
I did not share this experience. I attempted once to talk to my husband about it, but it was such a devastating experience, both emotionally, psychologically, theologically, that it just seemed like too much grief to put on to another person, especially. I mean, if you love somebody, you don't want to say, oh, honey, let me tell you what's really out there. That it's not the heaven you've heard about. It's this annihilation. So I did not say anything about it to anyone for 20-some years. And my interpretation was, essentially the only thing I could come up with coming out of a Protestant background was that Calvin was right and that predestination actually exists, and that I was on the wrong side. Predestination meaning the idea that God has predetermined before we're even born whether we will be saved or not. And clearly, I was on the wrong side of that equation. So it was, I have said a couple of times in lectures that to call these distressing is kind of like saying that a woman in childbirth is experiencing discomfort. They are typically shattering experiences that take an enormous amount of work to come to terms with. And
Nancy, let's jump forward, and then we'll get into some specifics about what some of this might mean.
Sure.
As you mentioned, you had this experience in the early 60s, and it's many years later that you find yourself in a position to study near-death experiences, to evaluate them in a clinical setting, in an academic sort of setting. That's a heck of a coincidence, or is it?
Coincidence is, of course, the common word. It has felt as if I've been on assignment. I struggled for 20 years trying to come to some terms with the experience. And then at a particularly difficult time in my life, I was out of work. Everything had fallen apart. And suddenly there was this tiny ad in the newspaper for a part-time temporary job at this little startup nonprofit that I had never heard of. I'd never heard of near-death experience. But I was hired as office manager for this little bit of just a scrap of an organization. And it took about 3 weeks for me to realize that there was a name for that experience I'd had. And yet the only other experiences anyone was talking about were the radiant ones. So I thought, well, maybe it was just me. But I was answering the phones in the office and opening the mail, and every once in a while there would be a letter